Welcome to Stitchery Stories, where textile artists share their life in fabric and thread, inspiration, techniques, disasters and delights. And I'm Susan Reeks, enthusiastic embroiderer and textile arts dabbler who also loves podcasting. So take a break and enjoy our light-hearted chat, and please share with your friends so they can enjoy it too. Hello and welcome to our lovely guest today, Lianne Van Leyen. Hi Lianne.
Hi, Sue.
It's brilliant to speak to you today. Now, so we're trotting around the world again with Stitchery Stories because Lianne is from Ottawa, Ontario in Canada. In fact, Eastern Ontario, is it? What's the proper description of where you are, Lianne?
I live within the city of Ottawa, but the kind of the region would be Eastern Ontario.
Right. Okay. Right. We've got that right then. Brilliant. So, and I've got a bio here for Lianne, which I'm sure you'll all find really interesting. So, by day, I am a historical domestic interpreter and historic cook at a world-class living history museum, Upper Canada Village, which is located in Eastern Ontario along the St. Lawrence Seaway. I specialise in historic cooking, preparing and serving period-correct meals and desserts from recipes published in 1866 or earlier. And there's a lot of interesting detail there from Lianne about her current role. So I'll put that on her episode of Stitchery Stories. And prior to attaining my dream job in 2018, I started out in fine arts, worked in child protection, banking, and higher education management. By night, I am an artist, an antique sampler collector and reproductionist, cross-stitcher, and the owner of 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers. I live in a one-room schoolhouse that was indeed built in 1897 and own a church built next door in the 1920s. Ooh. My husband and I are also caretakers of 3 classic British vehicles, a 1957 Series 1 Land Rover, an ex-military Series 3 Land Rover formerly deployed as part of the British Army of the Rhine, and a 1961 Triumph TR3A. I have spent many years learning to paint and draw, and teaching myself many different crafts, including cross-stitch. As caretaker of a growing collection of antique schoolgirl samplers stitched from 1750 to 1940, collected mostly from Great Britain, with the remainder from the USA, Netherlands, France, Spain, Switzerland and Canada, and owner of 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers, I am committed to reproducing antique needlework and producing patterns for the modern stitcher, increasing exposure and interest in historical textiles and needle arts within and outside the stitching community. I present to individuals and groups interested in my collection and in learning more about samplers and their history. So we'll come across the detail of what Lianne is doing there, and you can find out more about 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers and see pictures of Lianne's work on her Facebook and Instagram. So I'll give you the links for that now. So that's very simple. 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers is where you'll find Lianne on Facebook and Instagram. And she has an Etsy shop, which is 1897 Schoolhouse. And her patterns can be purchased from her Etsy shop there are some needlework shops as well that carry her patterns. So again, all the details, I'll put those on Lianne's episode of Stitchery Stories, and you can go and find out from Etsy and follow her on Facebook and Instagram. So there we are. Now, that was quite and I've cut bits out as well. So fascinating background, Lianne. I'm sure we'll get into that as we go along. So before we start digging into the history of all of this, would you like to share with us what you're working on and what's got you excited, Lianne?
Absolutely. I'm really, really excited because about 52 weeks ago, I had finished a model for a sampler that actually comes from Canada. Her name was Alfreda Lewis, and she finished her sampler in 1833 at 8 years old. I had been planning on producing her sampler for some time and ran into a lot of technical difficulties. And this afternoon, I'm going to the printer that I work with, and final decisions are going through. And this pattern is finally going to make its way out to the public after 52 weeks of frustration and work and certainly reevaluation, I would say, in terms of my expectations of how I offer my products to people.
Right. Oh, well, that's really exciting then. So something's come, as you say, that sounds like a year of, hard work and what do you say, frustration. So, would you like to share with us some of the issues that you've had with bringing this sampler to the light of day again?
Certainly. One of the things that I talk about, I usually do a write-up on each pattern, and I really try and talk about the sampler or something I've learned along the way.
Yeah.
And in reproducing Alfreda, I really had to, I talk about getting it in my own way, and I've talked about this in other places of seeing work, getting it too close to my face, and I can't evaluate it, I can't work with it.
Yeah.
And Alfreda did that to me. She was one that really challenged me for a long time. But the real delay has been in the technical aspects of printing, because I've spent probably 10 or 15 years before I launched my first pattern deciding and planning for the kind of the evolution of 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers. So I had a real idea of what kind of product I wanted.
Yeah.
The problem is that I want to keep the price point low, and I also want to use a local printer. And to be able to have it so that I can scale it, meaning I can have enough patterns produced and at the quality level that I want to offer,
yeah,
it was causing issues. So realistically, at the end of the day, I was having problems with paper cracking on a back spine because I wanted to do a booklet, and I've had to back away from that. It took me a long time to just be able to back away from an idea and say, okay, it's going to be individual pages rather than a booklet, which, when I'm talking about it now, it seems like such a small thing, but you spend 10 or 15 years dreaming of something, it's very hard to kind of walk away from it.
Well, yes, I think we can, excuse me, I think we can all relate to that for sure. So with these then, so you take a sampler that you have, and then do you kind of copy it exactly, or do you kind of make adjustments and kind of scale it so it fits on a certain size? What's the process there? I guess I'm being nosy about.
So I collect them first, and then I start thinking about them. I've got about 100 of them.
Wow.
Yes, I've been collecting for a while, and the majority of them come from your country, from the British Isles. And then once they come here, I use an online software program called PCStitch. And I would say yes to all your questions. Yes, I copy exactly. Yes, I make adjustments where necessary. Yes, I will fill in. All of those are the above, because realistically, what I specialize in is ragamuffin samplers. So if you look at some of the pictures on my Instagram or Facebook, they're not perfect samplers. They have holes, they have thread that is lost, they have threads that have bled throughout the whole piece. So there's an interpretation there. So I really hesitate to say reproduction, because they're not in a position where I can really just reproduce. Sometimes I have to go with them and make some decisions. And that's where sometimes, like I was talking about earlier with Alfreda, you have to kind of get out of your own way and make a decision.
Right. Now, and of course, really, when we think about these were made by young girls for them to practice doing the needle with. They weren't really designed to be looked at, 100 and whatever many years later, with a different eye, were they? They were a practical piece done by children. So what do we expect them to look like?
Well, they were a practical piece, and in some regard, they were also a piece of marketing. They were something that, especially when you start looking at samplers done in silk, they were very much about showing off the work, showing off the family had enough income, that they were investing in their girls' education, when education of girls was something that wasn't what we would see today as being an expectation and a right.
Yeah.
So they are more of a showpiece, but realistically, if you look at some samplers, they come through time in great condition because they've really been protected. And then some of the other ones, they're kind of like, they're time worn, and they've really been loved and they've been exposed to the elements. And then, you start to see their age on them, just like I'm sure I start to see my age and the little white streak coming in my hair. But, it's the same kind of idea that they show their age and they show the time.
Right. Okay. And so with the samples that you have, is there an element there of preservation or protection? What do you do with them? Does some of them come into in a right state that you need to do something with them to keep them alive, as it were?
Absolutely. So the majority of my samplers don't come framed. They come already either attached to a board or attached to a piece of paper, sometimes glued down. So in those particular cases, I'll remove them from the board. Sometimes not. I show one on my Instagram feed where I haven't removed her yet. But I keep them in acid-free tissue paper. I keep them, in an environment where we have low humidity. But I'm not treating them as if they're a museum piece, and it's something that sometimes becomes a conversation piece with people.
Mm-hmm.
I want them to be used. I want them to be touched. I want them to be seen. So, when we think of general conservation rules of how you would conserve and look after antique samplers, I don't go to that extent with this group because I really want to make sure people can benefit from seeing them and handling them.
Yeah, and are they? And you said you've got 100 or something. So where do you store them? So can people come and look at them? What, or are they kind of stashed away in your house? What do you actually do with them once you've got them?
So I keep them in, I have a schoolhouse, and upstairs I have 3 rooms. So 2 of those are my craft rooms. One is my production area. One is where I store those.
Yeah.
And typically people don't come to me, I go to them. So like you have in Great Britain, we have guilds.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I'll take them out to guilds or presentations. I actually have a presentation in a museum in Gananoque coming up March 6th. And then I'll take them out and give people an opportunity and lay them out on the tables. And then we have a conversation, a dialogue, rather than just a presentation. So they can look at them and touch them, turn them over, see what the effects of times are on the front and the back of the sampler.
Right. Oh, how lovely. Yeah. So you take them on tour then when you go and you speak about them and take them with you so we can all have a good old look at those as well. Oh, that's great. Yeah. Because so often when we go around, historic houses and you see things and they're all either A, hidden behind glass, B, it's really dark and you can't actually really see very much. And you're absolutely dying to put your fingers on them because you can't look properly with just your eyes, can you? You've got to look with your fingers as well. And it's like, oh no, you're not allowed to touch anything. So yeah, I think that's really nice for them to be to remain a living entity that people can enjoy and study and look at. So, oh yeah, I like that. So, what got you started on the sampler collection then? You said you've been thinking about this for 15 years or so. So where's this all come from?
Well, I think it's a continuum because I grew up being surrounded by makers, people who did things with their hands, whether it was my grandfather as a beekeeper, it was being taught crafts myself, or my aunt who was a crafter. I could go on for hours of all of the exposure to makers that I've had over my life.
Right.
And eventually I got to a point where I taught myself to stitch. And then it went on this kind of journey where I just started discovering things. And eventually a sampler, I saw one and decided I'm buying one. I don't care which it is. I'm just buying one. And it's not a straight path. It's more like a tree, and the roots were the making, the fine art and the all the crafts I've taught myself to learning how to cross stitch is just kind of one branch over here. Yeah. And it's grown from there almost like a tree to bring in so many new experiences.
Now, a lot of the samplers, they're all cross stitch, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we're talking about those kind of samplers where there's lots of cross stitch in different shapes and some kind of motto or a phrase or those kind of things. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So what got you on the path of creating a collection then? Because having one is one thing, and then and then came along 2, and now you're at 100. How did that happen? What were you thinking about?
Well, I've said, before, how did I ever work at Upper Canada Village? It was my grandfather's fault. Collecting, I think, would be my mother and my grandmother's fault on my mother's side. And that's because it was just something that I grew up doing, whether it was having a collection of antiques of some particular kind or seeing my mom do that. Right. So it just became like, oh, there's another one. And oh, there's another one. And oh my goodness, look at this one. And it didn't happen immediately. I think I had a single sampler for about 4 or 5 years. Right. And then I've been seriously collecting for the last, I would say 4 or 5 years at the most, 3 years really solidly. So in a given year, I might pick up 20 or 30 samplers, but I'm not talking high-end samplers. I'm talking sometimes I can pick them up for $20 Canadian.
Right.
So when you think of volume, it's not necessarily like, someone who is a serious collector who goes out and collects a $5,000 or a $10,000 sampler. That's not the quality I'm looking for.
Right. And that's how much people pay for samplers, is it? I have no idea.
Oh, absolutely. If you, there's a public television station in the United States called PBS, and they have a show called Antiques Roadshow, which I know is quite similar to something that you might
Oh
have
yeah,
back
we've got
home.
an Antiques Roadshow as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and there are ones that are on there that can be 30,000 Americans. So,
Wow.
depending on the
Yeah.
value to whoever's buying it, it's supply and demand. You could, there can
Yeah.
be samplers that are just astronomically priced, and then there's the ones that I collect, which are just more kind of everyday.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's the charm of a lot of these things, isn't it? That there's some kind of like utterly perfect ones, which for whatever reason are now being valued at $30,000, and then there's the ones that a young child's done and it might have a hole in now or whatever. So, which then again brings back this nice thing about you reinvigorating these and making them available for other people to have a go at as well, which I really like. And so, where did you get the idea then of the whole reproducing it? Did that come because in calling yourselves the Schoolhouse Samplers? Did the Schoolhouse come first, or the Samplers, or did they both happen together? Where was the idea? Where did that idea come from?
The Schoolhouse actually came before I met my husband. He had it before I met him in '96. So I would say the
Right.
samplers came after. But, if you going back to the question of how did I get started, I taught myself how to stitch. And quite soon into that journey, I started to stitch needlepoint kits, Elizabeth Bradley kits. So Berlin woolwork, Biedermeier period kits.
Mm-hmm.
And I just love those. And then all of a sudden I started to think, well, are these historical? Are there patterns that were available? And I went to eBay. I wasn't buying at the time, but I started to see the patterns that were there. So those original hand-colored Biedermeier patterns, I couldn't afford them, but I could afford Elizabeth Bradley. And then somehow I got over onto the antique section on eBay and saw, oh, there's antique samplers. And at the
Right.
same time, I was discovering Blackbird Designs, which is an American cross-stitch company. The ladies, some of their work is based on reproductions, but more interpretations. They'll rearrange things.
Right. Yes. Yes.
And so all of this kind of came together to, oh, I really like these. And then all of a sudden I was collecting, and then it was, well, I think I could do that. Why don't I give it a try? And it took me a long time to get from I can do that, why don't I give it a try, to actually doing it. I'm talking years. So
Right.
again,
Yes.
that progression of, when am I gonna do this? What am I thinking of? How am I going to be able to bring this to fruition? Especially when I was working in a corporate environment through a lot of this exploration that was happening,
Yeah.
where I just didn't have time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's, I think that's an important point you raised there, Lianne, is that especially when we're working in a corporate environment, you're kind of sucked into that life, aren't you? What you're doing it fills your head, even though you don't want it to. And so having that mental freedom to be able to explore something totally different from what it is that you're currently spending your time on, it's really hard to be able to do that. And although we say, well, we haven't got time, it's not always necessarily the time. It's the fact that we haven't got the headspace because we're so busy doing those other things. I think that can be quite a battle as well, is to just, yes, we can make some time, but is our head in the right place to be able to then sit and think about how we're going to bring cross-stitch samplers into the world? See, does that make, was that a reflection of what you felt?
Absolutely. You could be speaking for me, because that was absolutely, there was a whole journey. I stopped working for a large bank in 2008, and 2018 I ended up releasing my sampler, and I got a college diploma in there. I ended up trying other things in business, and it took me about a year of working with a job counselor to get my head around the fact that I could do what I had always wanted to do. I had always wanted to have my own business, whether it was in fine art or doing this, and that permission, that headspace to get to, yes, I want to do it, but stop telling yourself that you can't do it. It's just get in there and start moving along and doing it. So, you're so right that, sometimes the headspace isn't clicking with what you really want to be doing, and it, but is finding that bridge to be able to get to that place. sometimes is very difficult. And whether for me it was a job counselor, but it was also, I used to read blogs. I would read things on Instagram and Facebook of other designers who were going through similar journeys, and reading them sometimes gave me permission to start thinking about it in a different light and start thinking, you know what, it's not that I think I can do this. I know I can.
I know I can do it. And it's not just some random flight of fancy. It can be and will be real. So yeah, hats off to you for sticking with it, because I think these things take so much longer than what we ever think they will. And then we start to beat ourselves up about it. Oh, this is taking forever. Well, there's reasons for that. It's taking forever because you're not quite ready yet, or you're still trying to work something out. And some of these things can't be rushed. So that's really great. Now, I just want to ask you as well. So your day job, your dream job, that sounds absolutely fascinating. I'm kind of like missed out some of the detail there in the excuse me, in the introduction. But that sounds like there's a place in the north of England called Beamish, which sounds like the same kind of thing. And there's people wearing the outfits and doing cooking and doing all sorts of things in there. So it sounds like that. Sounds wonderful. How did you get on with that?
I kind of mentioned it just in passing a couple minutes ago, how it was my grandfather's fault or my grandparents' fault that I worked there. But what that reference means is that when I was about 3 years old, my grandparents would take my sister and I camping. And every year they used to, what we would call draw the mail, and they were limited to how much time they had. So they would deliver the mail, and then we would pack the trailer and we would travel to Cornwall, which is about 3 hours from where I grew up. Yeah. And we would go to Upper Canada Village. But we never had a lot of money, and my grandmother wasn't very able to walk around. So I only ever saw the village from the outside, and I toured on this big train that they had, or little train. Anyway, you fast forward years later, I've always wanted to work at this place. And in this transition that I talked about, I ended up talking to a job counselor, and I said, she asked me, what do you want to do with your life, Lianne? And I said, well, there's two things. I want to work at Upper Canada Village, and I want to have my own business with cross stitch. And she said, well, why don't you do it? And I spent many, many months, coming up with every excuse and just not getting on with it. And eventually then I applied for a position just at the time I was launching 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers, and everything came together within, a matter of weeks. And it just happened.
Wow. Well, that's just absolutely fantastic. I'm so glad I asked that nosy question. So there you are. You say you've designed the kind of life that you want. You were wondering if it would be possible. You've said it, and then look what's happened. There you are. You're working at that place, which sounds absolutely fantastic, and you've launched your 1897 Schoolhouse Samplers as well. So that's just brilliant. That's really, really great. I'm sure everyone's going, yay, in the background here for that one.
It feels like that. I pinched myself for a very long time just to say it was real. I was living it.
Oh, that's just really fantastic. Now, we usually talk a bit about inspirations and techniques. So I guess in some respects that cross stitch is a favourite technique of yours then?
It is. There's some new stitches that come along in some of the samplers that I teach myself as I go along. But as far as inspiration is concerned, really history, color, nature, I find inspiration everywhere. And sometimes it's about kind of winnowing that down. Mm-hmm. What can I actually do in the time that I have, rather than, kind of pinging off all of these things that are just kind of drawing me in. Sometimes it's, make sure you focus on something rather than being inspired by absolutely everything.
Right. Yeah. And so at the moment, obviously, your focus is these samplers. Now, you were saying that, or rather on your thing there, that you've got a number of patterns at various stages. So do you want to just talk us through the process that you go through to kind of bring one of these alive? I'm sure everyone will be fascinated about that.
Certainly. So as I mentioned earlier, I look for the sampler, and looking for samplers happens pretty much every day. There's a bunch of different places that I'll look to buy samplers. I'll buy them. I'll bring them into my home. I'll start taking a look at them and then decide, okay, well, these are the ones that I want to reproduce. I will travel like I did last weekend, 3 hours to the south and pick out fabric at a local needlework shop called the Stitcher's Garden.
Local needlework shop, 3 hours away.
Exactly.
Oh, dear me.
3 hours is not bad.
I can tell you live in the middle of nowhere.
Well, you have to reference where I live. I live in Canada, so anytime you want to go somewhere, it's going to take you time, unless you're in a city.
Oh, that is excellent. Yeah. Anyway, sorry for that. Go on, carry on. So you've been to your local shop 3 hours away, yeah.
Yep, and I might at the same time have already started to chart it, like I said, on PCStitch.
Yeah.
Then I will. I show some pictures on Instagram and Facebook. I have 3 lines of over-dyed floss in cotton that I primarily work with right now. I'm going to be starting to work with some silks as well, and I will pick out every iteration of color that I think that will be suitable for that sampler. And then what I will do is I will sit down with that fabric and those colors, and I'll start to make decisions. Very dynamic process. I could change colors. Then what I will do is I will do my edits in my online system, and then I will do the photography. I'll do the graphic design. I'll do all of the layout, and then I take that to the printer, and the printer will print it, put the graphic design together in their program, and they'll print the final product for me. So up until that point, with the exception also, my husband does all of my framing. He does that from Antique Sampler, or Antique Frames, I should say.
Yeah.
He will resize those. But other than that, everything up to the print production is something that I have full control and full responsibility for.
Right. So that's a really interesting a real creative process. You're involved, as you say, it's your creativity that's bringing this alive, and there's so much more to it. It's not just copying a sampler, is it? As you say, you're making decisions there about the colour and how these things are going to work, and how it's going to chart and all of those things. So yes, I can see therefore that your history of being interested in making things and teaching yourself how to do things has really come into the fore when it comes to bringing these things alive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That for me is the challenge, and the real joy of doing this is every step along the way of making those decisions. And sometimes it's also the challenge, because I've had to get out of my way a couple of times and put things aside for a while, some of them for almost 2 years, because I couldn't make a decision. But yes, it's all part of that whole process.
Yeah, it's fabulous. And do you have a high point in all of this that you would like to share with us, Lianne?
I think the high point really was that time where I made the decision that I was moving forward. I was reproducing patterns. I started working on the first one. I applied for the job and got it at Upper Canada Village. And as you said, I created a life. And that's what I really wanted was, I didn't have any timelines for how this was going to play out. I knew that it was going to take me time, but I now had created the environment in which I could do what I wanted to do. I worked in the summer. I would then have this in the winter. And then there's been so many high points along the way, including just today, sitting down and speaking to you, someone from the country that I love so much, as you can tell, having old, British vehicles, and I collect British samplers, and I watch period dramas and, all of that stuff. And I never would have done all of those without stepping out and saying I wanted something. So, in terms of this journey, it was there. But if I go farther back, I go back to a time when I was working in corporate America. I didn't know anyone outside of my job and my family, and I sent an email to 2 people. And those 2 people in my area said, you know what, why don't you come out to a stitch along with us? They were complete strangers. I went to Lynn Jones's place, and I spent the day with them. And everything has blossomed from that opportunity that I took to reach out to strangers to say, you like what I like? Would you be interested in getting to know me? Because I'd like to get to know you.
Right. And that is just a brilliant thing to do, is to make that connection. And you have been so purposeful in what you have built for your life. And when I moved from France, I moved to this place called Hornsey. I didn't know anybody here. There was no reason. There was no reason for me to be here other than I chose to be here because of a number of things. And I used to do the same. In fact, I used to, it's easier when you have a small child as well. So, he was 9, I think, when I came back here. And I would start chatting to other mums. And then if there was somebody I thought, I could quite get on with these, I would literally give them my phone number and just say, I know this sounds like an 8-year-old, but kind of, would you be my friend? Would you like to have a coffee? And, and you have to reach out sometimes to do that, and it feels a bit scary. But there again, everyone's always really nice, aren't they? And think, yeah, of course they do, because other people like to meet people as well. So yeah, that's a really great story that you've shared with us there, Lianne. Thank you for that.
Oh, you're welcome.
Now then, so we usually go from highlights, don't we? So do we have anything that didn't go quite as planned and could possibly be described as a disaster? And usually, more importantly, what did you learn from that experience, Lianne? Have you got anything that we could have a bit of a giggle about?
Certainly. I think I kind of mentioned it a couple of minutes ago. It's actually a sampler called Marianne Burton. And if you look on my Instagram feed, towards the bottom, there's this, I think, beautiful photo of my desk, and it has the sampler and a piece of fabric and all of my overdyes around it. And I started out with this idea I was going to reproduce her. And she's been on timeout for the last 2 years because we don't play well together. I mentioned that about get out of your own way because I couldn't make decisions. Part of it was the back of her sampler had one set of colors. The front had a different set of colors, and one color on the back could then respond in the front to 4 or 5 different colors. And I couldn't figure her out.
Right. Yeah.
I mentioned that as well about Alfreda, about making decisions and feeling confident about it and getting out of my own way. And it's kind of been a journey as well over the last couple of years of reproducing and just doing it over and over again to get to a point where I trust my instincts. And I've had that problem in fine arts and other places where sometimes you just don't trust your decisions.
Yeah, yeah.
So ultimately, the bottom line is she's sitting on my dining room. I wish I could tell you that I'd finished her and she's ready to go. But I'm finally at a place where I think I can make those decisions effectively. And I know that because I'm starting to work in silk, which is another area where I hesitated to kind of jump into an area where I wasn't confident. So I think the most important lesson for me was learn to trust myself and just, when I need a break, set something aside and then come back to it, but don't leave it so long.
Right, yes, because there is that fine line between it is always a good idea to take a step back and just leave something and let the thoughts percolate a bit. And that's as true in IT as it is in, embroidery, needlework, whatever it is that you're doing. Take a step back. But then it's also too easy to forget about it as well, isn't it? And it never, ever comes back to us. So really, this is a combination of it's not a disaster anymore, is it? It's you've made the decisions, you've trusted yourself, and it's now turned from being a UFO into something that's getting finished as well.
It will once I pick it up off the dining room table, but it's there every day. So every day I walk by it multiple times. It will get picked up.
And really, I suppose, since you've got so many samplers and obviously, kind of a list of ideas of ones that you want to get on with, in some respects, you're kind of surrounded by unfinished objects as well, aren't you?
I am. And it's the unfinished objects that are in the process, the ones that have chosen fabric and thread, and ones that are in the middle of stitch, or ones that are in the middle of production, or, different stages all the way along. And they're, like I said, upstairs and downstairs. So visually I see them. Yeah. But then there's the remainder of the 100 in the sampler collection that are kind of out there that to me I treat as unfinished objects. I got to get to them. So it's trying to manage and juggle all of those things and not let it kind of overwhelm sometimes.
Yeah, I was going to say, does it get to the point where you actually do feel overwhelmed because you can't let your mind just say, look, I'm working on these 8 or whatever it is, and the others can just sit there and just be quiet, will you all? Like a lot of noisy children. Do they talk to you?
Oh, they talk to me, that's for sure. I think one of the things that I'm not saying that I haven't had periods of that. Earlier in the year when I was experiencing difficulty of getting this pattern done, I was getting really frustrated because in this area of getting this pattern, this next one, because I've got a total of 6 that are ready to go to print production, and I've got another 4 that I have to frame, and then they're ready to go. So I've got about 10 right now that I can literally get out. Right, but it's kind of like everything stopped. But what's been a kind of a help is that when that's been happening and I've been frustrated, well, I'll go chart, or I'll go stitch, or I'll go pick fibers, or I'll go pick fabric. So it's almost like one part of the machine isn't working, but I can go and focus on something else. And to some degree, it would make me feel guilty because there were days where I'd be like, I'm just stitching today. I can't look at this. I don't have a solution for it. I haven't made a right decision on how I'm going to get over these technical issues, but I can go stitch, or I can go plan the next project. So in that regard, it's not all frustration, but it's one of those things where you really have to plan your time, because otherwise you're not going to get the ultimate goal, which is getting patterns out.
Yeah. And, I usually ask about planning your creative time. So now you've said, you mentioned earlier in passing that in summer you're at the village. So is that a seasonal, presumably because of the weather, it's closed in winter kind of thing?
That's right. I'm there from May through September, and then there's a little bit of work that happens around Christmas time. So a full-time job for the summer and then some in the fall. So primarily, because it was my own first year last year, I really focused on that job, and I'm an historic cook, and I'm also an interpreter, and I teach children cross-stitch. I focused on that, so really cross-stitch didn't come into it last summer. Mm-hmm. This winter has all been about, the cross-stitch and getting things done. So next summer, the key is going to be meshing those two. Of doing my job and then running this business, so that then I can hopefully move it through. But yes, there is a certain seasonality to what I can do based on the job that I have.
Right. So is there anything in particular that helps you to kind of manage what you're doing? I mean, you did say that if you're stuck on one thing, you can always go and do some charting, or you can, actually do some stitching or whatever. Is there any particular kind of methodology, I suppose, or decision process that you use to think, that's what I'm going to do today? Is there anything like that, or you just do what you feel like it?
I certainly have an idea of which samplers I'm working on, and sometimes if it's going really well, like it has with Jane Cheeseborough, I just finished her this morning. If it's going really well, then I will just spend every minute that I can in the morning to the night, anywhere I can, stitching. Mm-hmm. But realistically, I think the two things that really work for me is visual reminders of the work that is in process or that I need to focus on in terms of actual stitching stays on the dining room table, which is across the room from where I stitch. And then I use lists. I use a list to say when I have a hard date on something on my computer. So every time I turn on my computer, it's in my face.
Yeah.
And then I use little lists that I will do every single day, or I'll do it by the week and say, I need to accomplish these things this week, so that way I don't overbalance something and I'm spending too much time on one particular thing other than another. And then sometimes, like you said, it's just, I'm going to stitch today, or I'm just going to chart today because this is what I want to do. Yeah. And that happens too. It's just, sometimes it's just, that's what I'm doing today. But other times it's very much list driven, and I need to accomplish the following 15 things today to hit these deadlines. It goes back to that banking background and all of that, but I try not to do that all the time. I try to let more of the creativity kind of flow in there, and that's the real balance that sometimes I struggle with.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, we can't help how we think or how we've conditioned ourselves over the years either, can we? So, I'm just Mrs. Plans and deadlines and all the rest of it. That's my background. It's a habit now. I can't help it.
Exactly. I'm the same. Yeah. It's just bringing in some of those other things sometimes that I felt I couldn't include for very many years. That feels nice some days.
Yeah. Oh, I bet it feels absolutely lovely. Right. It's been absolutely fascinating speaking with you, Lianne. I've really, really found this absolutely really, really interesting. Now, as we just kind of come to the end here, is there any future plans or projects that is ready to share with us today? I know you just mentioned about getting, was it Alfreda, out to the printers. So is there anything that you'd just like to share with us there that we can all look forward to with you?
Absolutely. So Alfreda, the 10 other projects I'm working on, you can find on Instagram and Facebook. I mentioned I have an upcoming presentation at the Gananoque Museum on March the 6th. I'm going to be unveiling my first and only dated and place name sampler from Gananoque from, I think she's 1843, which I'm really excited to kind of bring her out and do some very in-depth research of her family, because I've got a lot of research about her home and her family and, the impact they had in the community. And ultimately, other than that, it's about exploring new opportunities, whether it's podcasts and joining people for conversations like this today, or maybe preparing something to provide to magazines. Realistically, it's open, and I'm so excited to see what comes next.
Yeah, and I'm sure we all will be. So everybody, make sure we just all go and follow Lianne on Facebook and Instagram. So that's a lovely place to start to build a community there. And then, of course, if you want to go and look at buying any of these reproduced samplers, then you want to get yourself onto Lianne's Etsy shop, 1897 Schoolhouse. So I think that would be really great. And of course, everybody, if you go and follow Lianne or any of the guests, really say that it's because you heard them on Stitchery Stories, because then everybody, that would be really nice. It's really nice when somebody says that. So just do that, won't you, for me, as a favour? Right, okie dokie. There we are. It's been really brilliant speaking to you, Lianne. I've absolutely enjoyed learning about your samplers and a glimpse into your life. But anyway, it's been brilliant. So thank you so much, Lianne.
Well, thank you so very much for the opportunity.
If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, then please join the Stitchery Stories fan club so you can get an email when a new episode is released. It's a quick and easy way of listening and of keeping up with any news and information around this podcast. Please visit stitcherystories.com. Of course, you can listen to Stitchery Stories on plenty of podcast apps at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify and plenty more besides. You can also ask your smart speaker to play Stitchery Stories podcast too. But wherever you listen, why not leave us a rating and a review to encourage other people to listen too? I very much appreciate you taking the time to do that for me. So that is the end of our Stitchery story for today. Keep stitching, keep smiling, and keep creating your very own Stitchery Stories.